He knew exactly what was going to happen. He had the data, he had the memo, he had the charts, and he had spent the entire night before screaming into a telephone trying to stop it. Nobody listened. The next morning, Roger Boisjoly refused to be in the same room as his co-workers when it happened. He couldn't stand the thought of being surrounded by people celebrating. So he went to a colleague's office, alone, and watched the shuttle climb into the Florida sky. He watched it for 73 seconds, and then he spent the rest of his life paying for it. Roger Boisjoly was born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1938. He earned a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Massachusetts in 1960, and by the mid-1980s, he had more than 25 years in the aerospace industry. His colleagues at Morton Thiokol, the company contracted by NASA to build the solid rocket boosters that would push the space shuttle into orbit, considered him a crackerjack troubleshooter. He was the guy you called when something wasn't adding up. He had also, at some point, served as mayor of the small Utah town where he lived, a man who took responsibility seriously. In other words, a man his community trusted. In the summer of 1985, Boisjoly was studying the results of a recent booster test. What he found made his stomach drop. The solid rocket boosters were built in segments. Between each segment, where the pieces joined together, there were rubber rings called O-rings, designed to seal the joint and stop super hot exhaust gases from escaping during the burn. On this particular flight, a secondary O-ring had been eroded while the primary ring never sealed at all. It was, in engineering terms, a catastrophic near miss dressed up as a routine anomaly. The system had held, barely, and nobody seemed particularly alarmed. Boisjoly was alarmed. On July 31st, 1985, 6 months before the Challenger launch, he wrote a memo to the Vice President of Engineering at Morton Thiokol. The subject line was, SRM O-ring erosion potential failure criticality. The closing line of that memo read, the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. He wasn't speaking in abstractions. He had real people in mind. The crew of STS-51-L, Challenger's 10th mission, was not a random collection of government employees. They were specific, fully formed human beings, and the more you know about them, the harder the rest of this becomes to hear. Dick Scobie, the commander, was 46 years old. He had dreamed of flying since childhood. Pilot Michael Smith was 40, and as a teenager, he was apparently a poor football receiver because he kept getting distracted by the sky. Ronald McNair, 35, had a doctorate in laser physics from MIT and was the second black American to fly in space, a 5th-degree black belt, and an accomplished jazz saxophonist who had been collaborating with a French composer on a piece he planned to record from orbit. Ellison Onizuka, 39, was a native Hawaiian who had worked in sugarcane fields as a boy to earn money for school. Judith Resnick, 36, was an electrical engineer and the first Jewish American in space. Gregory Jarvis, 41, was an engineer from Hughes Aircraft. And then there was Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Her mantra to her students was, "Reach for the stars." She had been selected from over 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. On the morning of the launch, she boarded the shuttle carrying her 9-year-old son's stuffed frog for good luck. NASA had arranged live television broadcasts in classrooms across the country specifically so children could watch the first teacher reach space. Now, here is the part that matters most, and it is the part that barely anyone talks about. On the night of January 27th, 1986, the night before the launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol got on a conference call with NASA officials at two different facilities, one in Florida and one in Alabama. The purpose of the call was to review the weather data and decide whether the launch was safe to proceed. The weather was the problem. The overnight temperature at Cape Canaveral had dropped as low as 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By launch time the next morning, it would still only be in the mid-30s. And Roger Boisjoly, the man who had spent 6 months sounding alarms about O-ring resilience in cold conditions, knew exactly what that meant. Rubber gets stiff when it is cold. A stiff O-ring cannot seat properly in the fraction of a second it has to form a seal after ignition. And if it does not seat, the gas finds a way through. Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson argued passionately on that call. They laid out the data. They recommended against launch. Their position was clear. Do not fly below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature at which any previous launch had occurred. The predicted temperature the following morning was 26 degrees, nearly 30 degrees colder than any prior flight. The NASA officials on the other end of the phone did not find this persuasive. One of them said, "I am appalled by your recommendation." Another said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" NASA then asked Thiokol to put them on hold and discuss privately. In that offline conversation, a senior vice president at Thiokol turned to his vice president of engineering, a man who had been supporting the engineers, and said the words that will define this story forever: "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." The engineers had no vote in what followed. Management voted. The recommendation was reversed. When Thiokol came back on the line, they told NASA the launch was a go. Boisjoly felt physically sick. He went home that night and told his wife, "It is going to blow up." He was not alone in that knowledge. Another engineer, Bob Ebeling, drove to the facility the next morning with his daughter, told her the shuttle was going to blow up, and beat his fist on the dashboard. Multiple engineers, people who had built these rockets and understood exactly what those O-rings were being asked to do, went to sleep on the night of January 27th, 1986, knowing what was coming. And they could not stop it. January 28th, 1986, 11:38 in the morning. Challenger lifted off from launch pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. Boisjoly refused to watch it in the corporate auditorium. He sat in a colleague's office instead. 7 seconds after liftoff, pilot Michael Smith could be heard saying, with audible wonder, "Go, you mother." And then, woo-hoo. At 52 seconds, a small orange plume had appeared on the side of the right solid rocket booster. A flame was leaking through the joint. The seal had failed almost from the moment of ignition, with cameras catching the first puffs of dark smoke at less than 1 second. At 70 seconds, Mission Control radioed, "Challenger, go at throttle up." Commander Scobie replied, "Roger, go at throttle up." At 73 seconds, the flame that had been burning through the booster joint encircled the external fuel tank, incinerated its insulation, cut through its aluminum skin, and ruptured the pressurized membrane within. The tank tore apart. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the shuttle's propellants, escaped into the atmosphere and ignited. The orbiter was ripped apart by aerodynamic forces. The fireball, burning at more than 6,000 degrees, lit up the sky over the Atlantic at 46,000 feet. Pilot Michael Smith said, "Uh-oh." Those were the last recorded words. On the ground, Boisjoly and Ebeling sat in silence as the screen went white. Now stop for a moment, because most people, when they think about the Challenger disaster, believe the crew died instantly in that fireball. They did not. The crew cabin separated from the orbiter intact, continued upward for roughly 25 seconds after the breakup, and then began to fall from 46,000 feet, a descent that took approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 3 of the 4 recovered emergency air packs, personal oxygen systems that required a deliberate, conscious action to activate, had been manually switched on by crew members after the breakup. The cabin showed no signs of explosion damage when it was recovered from the ocean floor 73 days later. NASA's official finding was that the crew possibly but not certainly lost consciousness during the fall, depending on whether the cabin lost pressure. What is not disputed is how the cabin ended. It struck the Atlantic Ocean at 207 miles per hour. The force was approximately 200 times the force of gravity. Nothing survived that impact. 7 people, 2 minutes and 45 seconds, falling. The Rogers Commission, the presidential investigation that followed, confirmed in June 1986 that the O-ring failure caused by cold temperature was the cause of the disaster. It found that the O-ring problem had been known for years, and that NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center had all but covered up a 9-year history of O-ring problems, with launch constraints related to the seals bureaucratically imposed and routinely waived on every single flight. An assessment paper at Marshall, written just 5 days before the launch, had concluded, "This problem is considered closed." Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist on the commission, performed a demonstration during a televised hearing that cut through everything. He dropped a piece of O-ring rubber into a glass of ice water and showed the commission, live on national television, that it lost its resilience in cold temperatures, and later wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." The commission criticized the decision-making process. It did not attach individual blame to any specific person. No one was charged with a crime or went to prison. The men who had overruled the engineers retired from their positions and faced no consequences. It was the engineers who had tried to stop it, men like Boisjoly and Ebeling and McDonald, who paid. And now, here is the contrast at the center of this story. The men who overruled Roger Boisjoly, George Hardy, who said he was appalled, Lawrence Malloy, who demanded to know if they should wait until April, and Jerry Mason, who gave the order to switch hats, retired from their positions. They faced no criminal or civil accountability. They lived their lives. Roger Boisjoly testified before the Rogers Commission, called the decision-making process the night before the launch unethical, handed over internal Theocol documents he had saved, and told the truth. When he returned to Utah afterward, his colleagues treated him, in the words of Ebeling McDonald, as if he had been arrested for a violent crime. Morton Theocol cut him off from all space-related work. NASA tried to blackball him from the aerospace industry. His managers isolated him daily. His neighbors, in the town where he had once served as mayor, stopped speaking to him. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and took long-term disability leave. In 1988, he said, "When I realized what was happening, it absolutely destroyed me. It destroyed my career, my life, everything else." He filed lawsuits against both Theocol and NASA. They were dismissed before they even reached the discovery phase. He said he believed the courts were afraid of what they would find. Bob Ebeling, the engineer who had beaten his fist on the dashboard that morning, carried the weight of it for 30 years. He blamed himself until the week he died. Ebeling McDonald, who had also refused to sign the launch recommendation, was demoted and sidelined. These were the men who had been right. And this is what being right cost them. After all of that, a therapist told Boisjoly to speak out more, not less. So he did, starting over as a forensic engineering consultant and traveling to universities and engineering schools around the world, delivering more than 300 lectures on organizational ethics and on what happens when an institution tells its best people to stop thinking like engineers. Multiple awards followed, and Auburn University named him a Distinguished Fellow in Management Ethics. He was still answering emails from engineering students until his final breath. On January 6, 2012, Boisjoly died at 73 years old. The same number as the second Challenger flew. And the people who were wrong, who said he was appalled, who demanded to know if they should wait until April, who told a room full of engineers to stop thinking, they are the reason 7 people spent 2 minutes and 45 seconds falling from the sky. Nobody was punished. Nobody answered for it. The men who had tried to stop it paid the biggest price of anyone who walked away from that disaster alive. And Boisjoly paid the most of all. But he never stopped talking. After everything they took from him, his career, his community, his health, he got back up and spent the rest of his life making sure nobody forgot the truth. He told his wife, "This is what I was meant to do, to have impact on young people's lives." And he did. The man who tried to stop it, who was ignored, who was destroyed for telling the truth, decided that the truth was still worth telling until the very end.